Hello everyone, William here for Lindsey's English Tutoring, and today I'm going to be analysing the language analysis task from the 2008 English exam, which is about sportsmanship. Now, the background information tells us that it's a column that's written by the coach of the team of children who play sports. And the coach is writing in response to bad behaviour on the part of spectators and the fact that volunteers find this sort of behaviour unappealing, and so they're slowly dwindling in numbers. And of course the club needs help, and the club wants to promote a positive atmosphere for its participants. So this piece is designed to persuade the reader, and thinking about the audience, mostly parents and some supporters of a local sports club. It's trying to persuade the audience to instill a good sense of sportsmanship in their children, right? You have to think about who is the audience, and then also think about what power does the audience have to do a specific thing that the author wants them to do, right? So if the coach is writing to parents, then he or she is writing under the assumption that parents are able to have direct influence over their children and instill good values in them, perhaps by telling them what they ought to do or showing them what they ought to do. Right? You have to remember that pieces are always written in order to try and effect some sort of change, right? And in this case, the change will occur from parents by either perhaps not engaging in antisocial and overly competitive behavior, and also showing their kids how to go about acting like good sportsmen and good sportswomen. So with all that in mind, let's jump into the first article. And usually what I like to do is have a skim through the article and think about what the general arguments are, what the general themes are, and whether there's any sort of logical way to go about divvying up the piece. In my opinion, the piece can be divided into two major themes. The first theme, I would say, is the idea that parents should serve as good role models for their children in terms of fostering a sense of sportsmanship in them, right? So the first theme, I would say, is role models on the parts of parents mostly, right? The second theme that I would say runs throughout the piece is the theme of condemning bad sportsmanship, but then also praising good sportsmanship. So a simpler way to put this is it's to align sportsmanship with good morals or good values, right? It's a values-based argument that's trying to show the benefit of sportsmanship, and also the way that sportsmanship represents the best parts of the human spirit, right? So to simplify, again, theme one, look for things that are trying to encourage good role modeling. Theme two, look for things that are trying to praise good sportsmanship and condemn bad sportsmanship. With those two themes in mind, and of course a question that arises is, how do you go about identifying these themes? Well, I've had a read through the article myself, and in about 5 or 10 minutes, just from going through it and thinking about, again, are there any sort of major ideas that keep on popping up throughout the piece? You will find ultimately that you can divide the piece up, hopefully, into a number of clean compartments. Right, and what I would do at this point is I would take out a pen or a highlighter of one color, and then take out a pen and a highlighter of another color. And then I would go through the piece and group the paragraphs or the lines or the sentences, as the case may be, according to the theme that I think the piece fits, the paragraph or line fits into, right? So for instance, this anecdote here about Emily, this to my mind is not so much about role modeling, but it's really about the visceral sadness and disgust that we ought to feel in relation to bad sportsmanship, right? Emily is just 8 years old and her dad yells at her for failing to shoot the goal. Again, this part here is not about role modeling, but toxic parents poisoning the club, again, associating bad sportsmanship with bad values, right, with toxicity. Good sportsmanship, on the other hand, is respect and it's heroism. So these parts here I would highlight in the color of praising good sportsmanship / condemning bad sportsmanship. But the part in the middle tells us that children learn best from their parents. And it's sort of a monkey see, monkey do situation, right? If you see your parents behaving in a certain way, you'll inevitably, so the argument goes, also imitate their behavior. So I would highlight this in a different color. And as to this little part here, you could either have this as a role model section, right? Because the Olympic runner serves as a role model for children in his act of heroism. Alternatively, you can see it as a praise for good sportsmanship, because it tells us that this is really what we remember. It's not so much who's won or who's lost, but rather who acts in the most noble and admirable way in the heat of the moment, right? As for this paragraph over here, again, you're recapitulating back to the idea of role modeling, right? It starts with something as simple as shaking hands, applauding good plays, and accepting bad umpiring calls gracefully. And that's how you can help your children understand good sportsmanship. Now returning again to the idea of sportsmanship being a reflection of the nobility of the human spirit, and also acknowledging the difficulty of it, right? It can be truly tough, says Sam, the author, to congratulate the opposing team after losing, right? But in a sense, in the challenge lies the nobility, right? If something is hard to do, but you manage to do it anyway and overcome the odds, in a sense, then that is something that is on its face admirable, right? So again, I would split this paragraph into two colors. And before I go any further, I will just address this idea of splitting the piece into a number of colors. The reason why you might want to do this is because if you take a look at the task as a whole, right, you've got one big piece here from the coach and then a political cartoon. And we know that political cartoons need to be analysed separately. They have different authors and different contentions. So accordingly, we need to probably dedicate a paragraph to the political cartoon. Now, if this was a picture that was embedded into this article from the coach, in other words, the coach maybe copy-pasted the image off Google Images or clip art back in the day, right, and put it in his article or her article to support his or her contention, well, then you don't need to necessarily analyze the picture in a separate paragraph. But here you do. You can see that it's written by someone named Jeff Parker. And you can see, looking at the caricature, sort of exaggerated style of the comic, that it is indeed a political cartoon. And so you need already to know that you will dedicate one paragraph, right? Or a separate paragraph to this image. Well, if you're insistent then on having a 3-body paragraph structure in your essay, 1 intro, 3 bodies, and 1 conclusion, then by process of deduction, you know that the piece itself, the article, is going to have to occupy 2 paragraphs, right? So then you should be thinking at this point, how do I go about dividing the piece into 2 paragraphs? And try to do this where you can in a logical way, right? So the easiest way, of course, is just to go from top down and maybe chop the piece into 2, right? Maybe from this part here all the way down to maybe, maybe over here under the phrase parents' behavior, maybe you could do 1 paragraph there, and then you could have a second paragraph for everything underneath that. So that is probably, in my opinion, the last resort, right? You always want to look for slightly more logical ways of dividing up your piece. I'm not saying that it's wrong to order your piece chronologically, to order your essay chronologically, but if you can split the piece into 2 in a logical fashion, that will be beneficial. And the reason is because you understand, or you show the examiner that you understand how the piece operates as a whole, and you demonstrate an ability to tease out, to draw out the major themes, major ideas, major techniques that flow throughout the piece. And you can see the big picture, in other words, rather than just looking at each individual tree. You sort of see the stream that runs throughout the forest. You see there's a big patch of evergreens or something on the right, and perhaps a big patch of birch trees on the left or something, and you can see the big picture rather than just knocking over one tree at a time. And so being a good English student, you want to show off your capacity to both zoom in and engage in close analysis, and zoom out and look at the piece as a cohesive whole at the same time. So that's why, in my opinion, if you can, try and find some sort of logical logical divide by which you can divide your essay. So when I went through this piece, I was sort of looking for major themes that arose. And for me, the 2 major themes were role modeling and the power of sportsmanship, right? And conveniently, I found that I think if you divided the piece up in this way, you roughly had a 50-50 split of the piece. In other words, roughly half of the words in the piece are dedicated to the first theme and half to the second theme. And of course, it's not always going to be that convenient, right? Sometimes you might have one idea taking up 1/3 of the piece, and then a second idea taking up 2/3 of the piece, right? But that's not something to be overly afraid of, because, just because one of the ideas takes up 1/3 of the piece, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have a smaller paragraph, right? It may be that for the second idea that runs throughout the piece, the one that takes up 66% or 2/3, you be a little bit more selective, right? And you find the devices that really show off your ability as a student, maybe find some really nice emotive language rather than sort of going for easy pickings, like statistics or something. Try and find a couple of words or phrases that you think you can go really deep on. Focus on those, and then maybe sprinkle in some other devices. But you don't need to necessarily go through the second idea and pick out every little bit of language and make sure that you include it in your essay, right? So you have a lot of flexibility with this, and that's what I want you to understand. It's a dynamic exercise, it's a fluid exercise, and you will get better at it with practice. But it's thinking logically that will really help to set you apart from other students when it comes to the criterion of structure, right? Now, content and analysis is another matter, and we will go through that shortly. But I just wanted to point that out. And I think this piece is a really good example of it, because most of the time you get quite an easy task in terms of structure, in my opinion, these days. The first half of the piece will be one argument. The second half of the piece will be about another argument, right? Whereas this is a piece where if you have that ability to group things logically, then you will really shine, because this piece weaves in and out, in and out, in and out of 2 different ideas. And so if you can sort of group them together, and then you'll have an edge on the students who just write a chronological structure. So just keep that in mind, put it in your toolbox, we'll move on from here and continue. So we were over here Some clubs have coaches who only care about winning and they abuse their own team and they make their members go ruthless on the field. And many of us were disgusted by this sort of behaviour. So which group does that belong in? Role modelling or the power of sportsmanship and the value of sportsmanship? Well, I would think the second, right? It's provoking sort of an emotional response of disgust and aversion. Again, why waste our Saturdays with louts like these? Faced with sports rage, good parents won't come anymore and coaches will hang up their whistles. Again, you might think that this is pertaining to being a good role model, because it talks about good parents. But really think about it properly. I don't think the purpose of this little paragraph is to really try to encourage you to be a good role model. But the focus of it more seems to be on the negative effects and also condemning people who engage in this sort of behavior as louts or thugs, in other words, right? And it's saying that people won't want to participate anymore. These generous people who volunteer their time will not want to partake in this sort of toxicity. Same with this little paragraph here. So now we transition back in to the idea of taking responsibility for being a good role model, right? So I'll let you have a skim through some of these paragraphs and you can see it's all about trying to encourage parents to do the right thing and to help their young children take pride in their accomplishments and to play fair and to have fun, right? So notice how you've got actions speak louder than words. So, it's not just about lecturing or telling your children what to do, but it's about you doing the right thing. So then they'll follow along, right? Children are very impressionable in their formative years. All right. So that's how I'd go about analysing the argument of the piece. Before we dive into the image, let's have a look at some of the language in greater depth, right? So you've got your structure, you've got your skeleton, you've got your argument now, but remember the task is also asking you to think about the written language itself, right? So this requires you to sort of go a little bit deeper and look at some of these phrases and devices. So Emily was distraught when the netball game staggered to an end. She didn't care that her beloved team had lost. She didn't care about her own performance. She didn't care about the sledging by the other team, right? So this is what you call anaphora, the repetition of the same word or words at the beginning of successive sentences, right? She didn't care, she didn't care, she didn't care. The most classic example of this being Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, "I have a dream." You may have heard of that. That phrase gets repeated throughout the entire speech. And the effect, at a very basic level, is to increase the persuasiveness and memorableness of the sentences, right? But you can go a little bit deeper here as well, right? You can think about, well, in this context, what is the effect that it has on us as the reader? What is the author trying to do here or trying to imply? And so what I would say is that the repetition of "she didn't care" or the anaphora, in a sense, diminishes the importance of each of these individual sentences, right? An analogy I might give you is when someone's nagging you, right? And you go, "I know," and they go, "Well, what about this?" And you go, "I know," right? And here it's the same kind of atmosphere, right? She didn't care, she didn't care, she didn't care. It diminishes the losing. It diminishes how you perform. It diminishes what other people do on the other team because they're kids as well, right? And the effect of the diminishing of these other extraneous factors is to then, by contrast, exemplify or accentuate the despicableness of what her dad is doing to her, right? By juxtaposing the minimizing anaphora, right? In other words, by putting the minimizing anaphora next to this awful little anecdote or image here of her dad yelling, the placement of these sentences actually intensifies the vulgarity and the emotionality of the second part of the paragraph, which is really the key idea that the author is trying to convey, right? And you have, other little things that you can always pick up, like staggered, for instance. If you think about that, the connotation is hopelessly, despairingly, meandering to an end, right? So it's reflecting her internal state. The game itself almost seems to be personified and, in a pathetic fallacy kind of way, reflect her own distraught emotions and sadness, right? And that's only intensified by her being 8 years old, encouraging us to feel sympathy for her, and encouraging us to see her with a greater degree of vulnerability, right? And the shortness of the sentence also, compared to all these longer sentences, it really draws emphasis on Emily as just 8 years old, and it imbues it with almost more of an accusatory tone, right? Or a tone of accusatory and emphasizing it as well. Imagine, for instance, if you're listening to someone present an oral presentation or a speech and they're just droning on and on and on, and then all of a sudden they say a really short sentence and they stop. Right? It grabs your attention. So that's the idea there. Poisoning, again, this is, associating immorality with bad sportsmanship. And notice the exclusive language, right? They're not the parents we want, right? So the contrast between exclusive and inclusive brings out this sense of alienation, right? If you are a bad parent or a bad sportsmanship encouraging parent, then we don't want you, and you should feel ashamed. You should feel excluded, like an outsider. However, if you are someone who is a good if you're a good parent, I'll just say, then you're going to feel a sense of greater pride and inclusion. And so it's a twofold effect. It's punishing you if you're doing what the author doesn't want you to do, and it's rewarding you with a little bit of dopamine if you are doing what the author wants you to do. Another way that you can look at this is that it assumes that you are on Sam's side already, right? And in a sense, this is, I guess, appealing to our desire to, not look stupid, right? Because if the idea of being a good sportsman or sportswoman is so natural and normal that Sam can assume that you're a good parent or you're a good sportsman or good sportswoman, then you must be a special kind of strange, absurd, silly, or stupid if you fall outside of that default mold, right? It's like this is so obviously the right thing to do that I don't even need to guess whether or not you're on my side. You obviously are, right? You're not an idiot. Most people are on my side. And so it's priming parents to feel like it's kind of the unnatural or silly thing to do to not be a good sportsman or a good sportswoman. And finally, you can also analyze this in terms of combining we want with our club to evoke a sense of union and pride in the organization. Okay. Continuing on, you see this repeated theme of children learning from adults in their lives, young people seeing adults, that repetition sort of reinforcing children's impressionable nature, right? You also see this value statement here that the real winners are those who know how to persevere and behave with dignity. Notice the very sort of moralistic language here. Perseverance and dignity are all things that we traditionally value in society from really the beginning of time, right? Heroism as well, self-improvement, excellence, constancy, right? All of these are canonical, classic values. And essentially the author is associating good sportsmanship with high morality. And here you have a little anecdote here as well, which is emotionally moving, right? And it, I guess, is highlighting, again, not only the moral value of good sportsmanship, but in fact, the emotional or the visceral value of good sportsmanship. It can probably move you to tears, right? That's the sort of power that it has. And then, you've got sort of more reinforcement of this. Again, sort of good sportsmanship includes heroic efforts, right? It's a triumph of the human spirit, right? Again, sort of appealing to ancient laudable values. You do here, however, have a little sub-point or argument which is worth pointing out. It's this idea that you don't have to do huge... you don't have to engage in huge feats of sportsmanship to be a good sportsman or a good sportswoman. You can shake hands with someone. You can applaud good plays that other people make, and you can accept bad umpiring calls gracefully, right? So it's not a hard thing to do, says Sam. And it can truly be tough to congratulate the opposing team after losing a hard-fought, close or important game. And, this is the idea that through challenge and overcoming challenge, we actually become better people and more admirable people. And here he's really spelling it out for us here, right? It's this idea that eudaimonia is equivalent to being a good sportsman or sportswoman, right? Living a good life requires the same sort of values and ideas and actions as being a good sports person. You have now this use of the word some, right? Some clubs have coaches, their own team, they think, right? Again, that exclusive language implying there's a small amount only of these people. We also see that he uses the word think, right? And think is an interesting word because it generally has a connotation that is more associated with singular points of view, right? I think, you think, and, with political parties as an example, right? You don't really say like the Liberal Party thinks or the Labor Party thinks. There'd be nothing wrong if you said that, but you don't see that as much in common parlance. You would say, or see rather, the Liberal Party believes, or the Liberal Party is of the opinion that, or the Liberal Party perhaps holds the position that, right? Think, especially when combined with they, actually has, in my opinion, a subtle minimizing effect on sort of the numerousness of the people who hold these views, right? So that's something to think about as well. It's quite subtle and maybe a little bit controversial, but do look out for those opportunities. Now, here you just have the evocation of disgust, really pretty straightforward stuff. And it's like sometimes the really emotional stuff is quite straightforward. You're looking for sort of instances like this, like louts, right? What is a lout? Well, it's a thuggish kind of person who is a little bit of a misfit, antisocial, and it's sending out the message that you're not going to be accepted in society if you behave like this. We're just going to think you're a rebellious teenager hanging out in the street, and shoplifting and smoking weed or something, right? Like that's the sort of vibe that the author's trying to imbue these bad parents with. When he uses a word like louts, right? They're the sort of connotations which might come to mind. So immature, belittled, outcast, misfit, right? Faced with sports rage. Again, this is quite interesting because it's like, road rage in a sense, sports rage. It's like almost pointing out the absurdity of the rage itself when it's about something like sports. And giving it a bit of a label that, again, makes it seem a little bit more foreign and alien, right? It's sports rage. Like, who wants to engage or be associated with sports rage, right? Coaches will hang up their whistles. Essentially these good volunteers are going to leave. And then if you want to have a go at anyone, have a go at me. Don't take it out on the kids. Really sort of emphasizing his own role as a protector here, and perhaps subtly positioning himself as a heroic and admirable person. And again, it sort of reminds us that kids are really vulnerable, and might make us think twice about treating kids in the way that the impugned parents do. Here you have a bombardment of, just two rhetorical questions, right? So when does winning take over from the thrill of just being part of the team? At what age do kids forget to just have fun, right? So thought-provoking rhetorical questions here. Compared to other rhetorical questions, which sometimes have a clearer answer, this is perhaps a more genuine question that invites you to sort of enter a more contemplative headspace, at which point, after priming you in that way, Sam can actually present to you some more flowing, logical, rational arguments, like, good sportsmanship is just one of several goals that they'd like their kids to achieve. Adults who emphasize good sportsmanship see winning as one of the several goals, right? It's all about helping the young athletes take pride, improving themselves, and helping to improve their self-esteem, right? The best coaches and parents encourage fairness, fun, and the acquisition of skill, right? And again, very sort of logical, empirical arguments. Actions speak louder than words. So, it's interesting that the rhetorical questions, depending on the context in which they're posed, can have a slightly different effect. So do be aware of little nuances like that, and don't just go, every rhetorical question is the same, every statistic is the same. That is not the case. Consider the fact that you have a modulation of tone, right? Going from a much more emotional tone, using things like disgust, right? And don't have a go at the kids, have a go at me, right? And then all of a sudden transitioning to sort of a more measured tone. And finally, pep talk or lecture. I guess lecture especially, usually in this context, when your parents lecture you, that might invite scorn in the minds of some, feeling like it's just monotonous droning on the part of parents that isn't really doing any good, right? So by using this word, it's implying that parents who nag their kids in this way and put pressure on their kids in this way aren't actually doing the most efficient thing for their growth. Okay, so those are some ideas in terms of how you might go about analysing the language. Of course, we haven't gone through every little thing that you could go through, but they're just some ideas for you, and I've tried to pick out some of the perhaps more nuanced points for you to go and have a think about. Let's finish up by having a look at the political cartoon. So defeat is death, right? And you've got this sort of plain white t-shirt, makes the person or donkey look rather simplistic, I guess. And in essence, the reductionist simplicity of that slogan in a way reflects the simplicity and the idiocy of the parent that the cartoonist is trying to convey, right? You can look at the exaggerated features like the big bottom, the massive mouth, the buck teeth, to essentially say that the cartoonist is trying to say that you're humiliating yourself if you engage in this sort of behavior. You can see the arms sort of in this, flexing kind of position, in a way demonstrating haughtiness or arrogance on the part of the parent, right? Like when you flex your muscles, swearing, using the hash symbols and the stars and the ats, again, just suggests that you're uncouth, right? You're a bit of a lout. And you can see the annoyed and scared and anxious faces of some of the parents and spectators, which, just implies that you're not going to be popular with your peers if you do this sort of thing. And sadly, you've got the children, right, who are watching and sort of feeling uncomfortable, afraid, ashamed, right? Imagine if this is your father or mother, how would you feel in this situation, right? Having that entire body of the girl placed in a rather prominent position, right? When I say prominent, yes, she's in the corner, but they really sort of let you see her in full, as opposed to, most of the people in the cartoon, except the donkey and the umpire and her. So we are supposed to sort of pay attention to her. And so you can say that ultimately the greatest stakeholder, says Parker, is the child herself, right? And of course, there's the obvious pun. A donkey is also known as an ass, right? So you're making you're making an ass of yourself. And I wish these sports aggressive parents could see themselves as we do. Again, implying a bunch of things, implying a lack of self-awareness, right? It's implying that you're going to humiliate yourself if you behave in this way. And, these sports aggressive parents, labeling the parents who behave in this way, what you might call an epithet, right? Sports aggressive parents, creating, again, a sense of otherness and alienation. And it's not something that, it's not a position that you want to be in, right? Okay. I think that just about does it for this piece. So I hope you found this helpful. Just a really quick recap, when you get a piece like this or any piece, have a read through it. Think about how you're going to structure your piece, right? We used logical deduction to basically say, well, we know the cartoon's going to be a paragraph, right? Of its own, right? We know that we usually want to have 3 body paragraphs, right? Most students and teachers like that. And of course, that's going to be for exams, right? It's going to be different if you're writing a SAC, right? Especially if it's a 90-minute SAC or 2-hour SAC. But, you know, you want 3 paragraphs and you've already got 1 occupied. Well, what does that tell you? Well, you're going to want to write 2 paragraphs for the piece. And so that means you're going to try and split the piece into 2 in a logical fashion. So then you go and look through the piece and you start looking for some threads or themes, and you're looking for maybe 2 main threads that run throughout that are hopefully more or less equal in sort of length or substance. And then when you found it, you go, aha, you know, and then you start highlighting the relevant parts according to the theme. And then you dive deeper into the language, right? And then you go and write your essay, and it's just really easy from that point on, right? Like you just look at all the parts that you've colored in the first paragraph color, right? And then you just go and talk about how the language advances the argument. Okay. That's all for today. So I hope you've enjoyed, and I look forward to seeing you, or I look forward to you seeing me in other videos. Take care.